So this is Guenter Goldsmith, and he's going to tell you his story.
Thanks. Good morning. She said, my name is Guenter Goldsmith. I'm a Holocaust survivor. Holocaust survivor is any Jewish male or female who lived in Germany or Europe during the time of Adolf Hitler's reign and was still alive in 1945. Several kinds of survivors. The real survivors are those few who were still living when the prison camps or concentration camps, as they were called, were liberated by Allied armies. And the young Jewish boys and girls, mostly from Eastern Europe, who were sent to German slave labor camps. And many of them survived. And they were the children, and even some adults who were hidden by some very brave Christian friends and neighbors. And I said they were very brave because if they would have been caught, they would have faced the same punishment as the people they were hiding. And then they were the lucky ones, anyone who was able to get out of Europe before 1942. And I was one of those very lucky ones. And since I never ended up in a concentration camp, I want to talk about the Holocaust by talking about growing up as a young Jewish boy in Germany during that time. But first I want to talk just a little bit about why there was a Holocaust. Germany surrendered to the Allies in 1918 to end World War I. Allied armies would occupy Germany. All their factories that produced weapons of war had to be shut down, and the army was disbanded. Consequently, there were thousands of Germans, mostly men, without jobs, no money, and no food. And they were desperately looking for somebody to get them out of this mess they were in. And along comes Adolf Hitler. He comes to Germany from Austria shortly before World War I. Completely unknown painter, but he joins the German army during the war, and after the war he stays in Germany. He's evidently a very charismatic individual, and he soon befriends some like-thinking and influential German men, and together they start their own political party, German National Socialistic Labor Party, and they call themselves Nazi for short. They're different even in the beginning. Instead of wearing just plain clothing, they wear these brown uniforms and these funny-looking brown caps with a swastika as a symbol. Soon they start to hold political rallies, mostly in southern Germany. Hitler is not only charismatic, he's also a very powerful speaker. And he promises the German people exactly what they want to hear. He promised them jobs, money, and food. And soon he starts attracting larger and larger crowds to his rallies. But sometime around 1926 or so, he's arrested for his political activities and he's sent to prison. While he's in prison, he writes a book, Mein Kampf, which means my fight. And in that book, he outlines all his plans for a stronger and better Germany, but also his plans to get rid of anybody who is not a pure German. This includes the gypsies, the gays, even the physically or mentally handicapped. He also needs a scapegoat. He needs somebody to blame for the terrible conditions that are existing in Germany, and he chooses the Jews because they are a very small religious minority living there. After his release from prison, his book is published, becomes an immediate bestseller, and when he starts holding political rallies again, starts to attract larger and larger crowds. And in 1932, Hitler is elected president of Germany. I was born in 1925 in a large city in northern Germany, but when I was about 5 years old, my parents and I had to move because my father lost his job and there were no jobs to be found. We moved to live with my mother's parents in a small farming community in western Germany. My grandfather owned some farmland, but mostly he raised and traded cattle. He and my grandmother grew up in that small town. They got married there, raised their family there. There were about 4 or 5 other Jewish families living there, but all of them were accepted as equals in the community because they were all German. The only difference being was their religious beliefs. A year later, I had to go to public school If I remember correctly, I was the only non-Christian boy in the school. But again, it didn't make any difference. I was accepted by everyone as an equal. Made friends with most of the boys in my class, and almost every afternoon after school we'd get together and play games. In 1932, Hitler is elected president, and a year later he declares himself Chancellor of Germany. The German Parliament, which is like our Congress, is dissolved. All other political parties are now illegal, and the Nazi Party is the only party in Germany. And he's the sole power. In essence, he became a dictator. Shortly after that, he started to implement his plans for making Germany better and stronger by having all the factories that produced the weapons of war open up again, and a new military was started. All this was done in great secrecy and in total defiance of the peace treaty Germany had signed in 1918. But it accomplished two things. He was building up an army for another war, and he fulfilled his promise that he made to the people that he would get them jobs and money, because all of a sudden thousands of Germans have jobs again. Soon he also starts his campaign against the non-pure Germans. The gypsies and any foreigners who live in Germany are deported. Gays and the handicapped are sent to medical institutions. And he finally also starts his campaign against the Jews. Starts very slowly, with a lot of propaganda, always blaming them for everything that was wrong and is wrong in Germany, even blaming them for World War I. But soon, stronger methods have to be used to influence the Germans to finally get out of Germany. Jews are no longer allowed to teach in public schools. They can't teach in the universities anymore. Can't perform in the theater or with symphony orchestras. And eventually they also identify the Jewish-owned stores, and the German people are being asked not to patronize them. Things even change in our small town, but mostly at the school. First class every morning was one where they taught about religion. Now that class was being used to teach about the superiority of the pure German, and eventually they also would teach anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jews. Naturally, I was excused from that class. I could no longer participate in any after-school activities. All of my friends now had to join the Hitler Youth Corps, which you can, I guess, sort of compare to Boy Scouts here, except there they were being taught to march and to shoot, and eventually when they got older they also had to participate in war games. Besides that, they were being brainwashed by the leaders to hate anybody who was not a pure German, and as well as the Jews. Naturally, none of them could associate with me anymore, so instead of playing after school, I would now have to help my grandfather on the farm because he was unable to get help. Everybody was afraid to work for the Jews. And just like that, I became an outcast in my own country. I went to that school for another 5 years, but there was only a couple of events that I really remember. One of the first laws the new government passed was that you could only own or read books by non-Jewish German or Austrian authors, and the same with music. You could only play or listen to music by German or Austrian composers. Every town, every city in Germany, there were big bonfires. I remember going there with my mother, like everybody else, carried out now illegal books there, and we threw them into the fire. But there was something amazing happening there. There were actually celebrations going on at these bonfires. And it's kind of hard to believe that people would actually celebrate doing something they really didn't want to do. But it was probably the first brainwashing that was done to sort of make the Germans follow orders without asking questions. Imagine if that happened here. All of a sudden you can't read your favorite books anymore. For instance, the Harry Potter books, because they were written by an English author. And the same with music. You can't listen to your favorite bands if they come from another country. I doubt very much if any of you would have been too happy about any of that. 1936, Germany hosted the Summer Olympics. This was going to be a time for Hitler to show off the new Germany, especially Berlin, where the games were being held. But mainly he wanted to prove to the world that the pure white German athletes were superior to anybody else. However, there was an African American named Jesse Owens on the US track team, and he almost single-handedly proved to the world that the Germans weren't any better than anybody else because he won 6 or 7 gold medals that year. Imagine what kind of a shock that was to the Germans, especially to Hitler and his friends, to watch an African American beat the best of their best superior German athletes that they had. One thing I will always remember, though, being chased home almost every afternoon after school by my former friends just to avoid being beaten. By now, lots of Jewish families were leaving Germany and they were going to countries where they would be accepted. Canada, the United States, South America, even China and South Africa. All of my father's siblings had already gone to the United States. Why my parents never left is something I'll never know. Maybe they felt safe because they lived in a small town. Maybe he felt safe because he served in the German army during World War I. Or maybe they just didn't have the way or means to get out. When a Jewish boy reaches the age of 13, he has a bar mitzvah. It's a religious celebration. At that time, he's accepted into his religion as an adult. Mine was scheduled for November 9th, 1938, but it was not to be. Evidently, the Jews were not leaving Germany fast enough, so stronger methods had to be used. When a French Jew kills a German diplomat in Paris, early November 1938, Hitler now has this excuse for what become the Holocaust, because all German Jews are blamed for what this one man did in France. The next day, November 7th, all over Germany, Nazi thugs were going around and they were destroying businesses and stores owned by Jews, and eventually they would also ransack the synagogues, our houses of worship, and eventually they would set them on fire. Same thing happened in our small town. There were only a few members of the party actually living in town, but they went ahead and first destroyed the 2 stores owned by Jews, and then eventually they went to the synagogue. There was already a large crowd standing there when my father and I got there. Some of them were even crying, but not one person said anything or did anything to stop them from ransacking the synagogue and setting it on fire. Everybody was afraid. There was the beginning of the Holocaust, a genocide that lasted 7 years. And during that time happened some of the worst atrocities ever committed against innocent people by people just like us, educated and supposedly civilized. And over 10 million would be killed. 6 million were Jews, but there were 4 million others, including some religious leaders and political leaders, or anybody who would speak out against the government. The next day, almost all Jewish males over the age of 18, including my father, were arrested and they were sent to secretly built prison camps or concentration camps, as they would be called. That morning I watched as the police came and arrested my father, took him away. A very kind man who never committed a crime in his life. His only crime was that he was Jewish. That was the last time I would ever see him. My mother and I now had to move because we were living in an apartment and no one was allowed to rent to Jews anymore. We moved to live with my mother's sister, lived in a town similar to ours, not too far away. Her husband had also been arrested, but she still owned her home and she lived there with her 2 young daughters and my grandmother. All of us now had to wear identifying armbands or yellow stars of David pinned to our clothing so that everybody would know that we were Jewish. I had to go to a segregated school for Jewish children only. School was in a larger city, about 10 or 15 miles away, and every weekday my cousins and I would have to ride our bikes there and back. My father died in December that year. He died of pneumonia. He got sick because he and all the other men were forced to stand outside the barracks all night during a freezing rain. However, in those days, they still shipped the bodies home in sealed caskets. At least we were able to have a funeral for my father. Later, anybody who died or was killed in a concentration camp, they would be buried in mass graves, and eventually they all would be cremated. Webster's definition of the word Holocaust is total destruction, especially by fire. So if we think about the burning of the books, the burning of the synagogues, the burning of the bodies, that word certainly describes exactly what happened during that time. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and that was the beginning of World War II. After the Polish government surrendered, special German police units moved into Poland, rounded up all the Jews living there, and they were shipped to concentration camps or ghettos. Some didn't even get that far. Many of them were just lined up in front of open mass graves. They were shot and killed right there. The next 3 years or so, Germany occupied almost every country in Europe, and in every country the same thing would happen to the Jews as it did in Poland. Meanwhile, the government confiscated my aunt's land and her barns, and they converted that into a prisoner of war camp for Polish soldiers. They were sent to Germany to work there. Eventually, they would also take away her home, and again, my mother and I had to move. And we finally ended up to live with her brother in a fairly large city. He was not arrested because he was married to a non-Jewish woman, had a little daughter, and they still lived in their own home. Again, I had to go to a segregated school, but things had gotten a lot worse by then. We could no longer go to the theater, concerts, or the movies. Weren't even allowed to go to public parks anymore. Couldn't buy our food in regular grocery stores. Everyone had to go to a food store for Jews only. Every family was assigned a certain day of the week and a time of day when they could go there. And the unfortunate ones who had to go there late during the day usually found very little food to buy. So I volunteered to work at the store a couple of mornings before school, and at least that way I was able to get our family's food. By this time, my mother is desperately looking for some way for us to get out of Germany, and she finds out about some children's transports that take Jewish children to the United States. You had to have somebody living in the United States who agreed to become your sponsor, and I was lucky again. I had an uncle who lived in St. Louis, and he did agree to be my sponsor. August 1st, 1941, my mother took me to Berlin, put me on a train with 10 other children, and we're going our way to the United States. That was the last time I ever saw my mother. It was just last year, 60 years later, that I finally found out what happened to her and everyone in our family. Evidently, in December of 1941, all Jews still living in Germany were rounded up, loaded on cattle cars, and sent to a concentration camp where almost every one of them would be killed. 3 weeks later, we arrived in New York, and when the ship passed by the Statue of Liberty, even though we really didn't know what it stood for at the time, all of us suddenly realized we were finally free. Next day, they put me on a train to St. Louis, and when I was met at Union Station by my aunt and uncle, it was the beginning of a whole new wonderful life for me. 3 weeks later, I had to go to high school, and soon after that, I was drafted into the Army. To me, that was probably the greatest honor anybody could ever bestow upon me, to allow me to fight for my new country against a country ruled by a vicious dictator. And while I was in basic training, I found out that if I volunteered to become a paratrooper, I would most certainly end up fighting in Europe, and that was certainly where I wanted to be. And I did join the 17th Airborne Division December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. But our big day came in March of 1945 when the division was picked to lead the airborne invasion of Germany. And when we landed immediately east of the Rhine River, I was among about 10,000 other American soldiers who would actually be the first ones to be fighting on German soil. What was even more ironic was that just 3.5 years earlier, when I left, I was probably one of the last Jews to get out legally, and that day I was one of the first back in again. After the war, I returned to St. Louis, and I've lived here ever since. Why do we still study about and talk about something that happened almost 70 years ago? We do because it's important that we remember. And maybe if we remember, we can prevent something so terrible from ever happening again. The Allies, and especially the United States, learned an awful lot from World War I and the Holocaust. Instead of just occupying the defeated countries, they actually helped them with their recovery. And consequently, we didn't have another World War 20 or 30 years later. In fact, those countries eventually became our friends and allies. There's still Holocausts happening today, usually in third world countries. Today we call them genocides or ethnic cleansing, but still thousands of innocent people are being killed. And the civilized countries are still very slow to respond. I want to thank you for listening to my story. I think we're going to have a little time for questions. So if you want to start asking, I'll try to answer. My name is Guenter Goldsmith. I was born in Hanover, Germany, November 12, 1925.
Tell me into what your family, were there siblings?
No, I was the only child.
And what was your life like?
Well, we lived in that town. I only lived there till I was 5 years old. Then we had to move to a small town in western Germany, and I lived there until 1941. Actually, in 1938, and then I left Germany in 1941.
And what was your childhood like?
Childhood was very normal until 1933, and then things started to change even in this small town I lived in. And like I told the kids before, I became an outcast in my own country.
Okay, but we're not even going to talk about what you told the kids before, because
I know.
we'll
Right.
put that in. But tell me, because I know you had said you went to school, a normal school, so tell me about, was it a happy childhood, what that was like?
Oh, I was just a very happy childhood. I was the only child in the whole family at the time. Had one uncle that lived in town, but he was not married. My other uncle came to St. Louis in 1929, and my mother's sister was the only other one that was married and had two young daughters. So they didn't have that many grandchildren.
And what type of things did you do with your family?
I don't know. I don't remember too many things we really did. It was mostly I had to help him out on the farm, especially after 1933, because he didn't have any help. My uncle traveled a lot. He had a car, and he did take me on a lot of trips. So he sort of took me wherever he went, which was nice.
So that's a good memory. What other good memories do you have?
Oh, we had a really good family life. There was a synagogue in the small town, and we did.
Okay, we'll start that over.
Yeah. Where were we?
You had a synagogue.
Had a synagogue, and I remember going to the synagogue, especially on holidays. We were not, if I remember correctly, we were not Orthodox. I think most German Jews were Reformed. My father was what I would call a peddler. He traveled around and sold women's clothing. He traveled around the farms, and that was it. That's what he did.
What did your mother do?
Just a housekeeper.
Mm-hmm. And so, was there talk? When was the first time you kind of felt something wasn't right?
Actually, not till probably 1933. Because after, up till then, actually we lived almost a normal life even after that in that small town. The only thing different was at school. But in the community itself, we just kept living the way we always did.
Tell me what happened at school.
Well, the same things I told him during the speech. As soon as Hitler became chancellor, things would change because they couldn't teach religion anymore. They had to teach about the superiority of the pure Germans, and then they would teach anti-Semitism in school. All the kids had to belong to the Hitler Youth Corps, and I was left all alone out there. I mean, nobody could associate with me anymore.
Did you? I mean, I know that there weren't a lot of other Jewish families living where you lived. As a young boy, did you ever question why? Okay, well, why am I Jewish and everyone else isn't?
I don't think so. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I know I was supposed to have a bar mitzvah, and I did take lessons. There was an elderly Jewish man there that I went to for lessons for the bar mitzvah. I remember that.
And did you have the bar mitzvah?
A year after it was supposed to be, we happened to be in Frankfurt. There was a synagogue still standing, and by some miracle there was even a rabbi there. So that's when I had my bar mitzvah, instead of when it was supposed to be.
Okay, so let me start off with, so you're helping your grandfather on his farm, and tell me about, you had said that you had gone with your mother and you had seen bonfires. Tell me about that.
When they had the bonfires to burn the books, well, everybody had to go there and carry their books there, and everybody threw their books in the fire. But instead of just throwing their books in and going home, everybody stayed around and they had a big celebration, which was unbelievable because these people were doing something that they really didn't want to do. But they were getting, the first, I think that was probably the first step of the government actually starting to brainwash the people to accept artists without questions. And that's probably what it was.
What city were you in then?
They had in a small farming community.
So did you also take books?
Yeah, yeah. My mother and I took our books there and threw them in the fire. But you had to.
And then when the Olympics came in 1936, what were you hearing about that? Well,
I knew about the Olympics, and I mean, surprisingly as it may be, I was still rooting for the German athletes. And I also would, when my former friends would march by on Saturday or Sunday mornings, I'd sit in a window, and I wanted very desperately to be one of them, even then.
So you had said that you got chased home after school?
Many days.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was just me outrunning them so I wouldn't be beaten.
Okay, well tell me, so you were going to an all-Jewish school. How many?
Oh, no. This was still at the same public school. All these boys were my best friends. And then all of a sudden they would hate the Jews. So not every afternoon, but many afternoons, they would actually chase me all the way home, and I had to run to avoid being beaten.
How old were you at that point?
Oh, 10, 11, 12.
So that's pretty frightening for a 10-year-old.
Oh, sure.
And when you got home, did your parents have any way of consoling you, of dealing with it? Oh,
I'm sure they, in fact, I don't remember this, but I'm sure my mother or father came to meet me once sometimes too, but I don't remember that. I do remember having to run home and make sure I didn't get beaten up.
You said that your father's siblings all had come over to the United
Right.
States. Was that a slow, one by one? How did that happen?
Yeah, I would say so. I think they started early. Most of them ended up in New York. Two of my father's brothers ended up in Oklahoma. I never met them, but I met everybody in New York. And while I was in the Army, I'd go up to New York once in a while and all get together.
How did they have the means to get out? They just, the foresight, how did they?
Both, I would think. See, when they were leaving, I don't know if you know, they could still take furniture and everything else with them. They had what they call lifts. They took them, they put them on a ship with them, and they brought them with them. They could take money and everything else. I don't know how much money, but they would, they lost their homes, they lost everything else over there. But by the time I got out, I could take 10 German marks, $2.50. That was it.
So tell me about when they came to take your father away.
Well, the police came to our home and they arrested my father. That was it. Simple as it was. This man had never done anything wrong in his life. So, and very, very soon afterwards, my mother and I had to move. So we had to leave town, and my grandmother was already living with my aunt. My grandfather he died in, I would say, I think I was maybe 7, 8 years old when he died. And my uncle, who was the one that lived with a non-Jewish woman, he'd moved out. So there was, nobody left of the family there.
So how long of a time period was it from the time they took your father till the time you found out he had died?
Let's see, he died in December 38, so it was like a month later.
So,
they arrested him on November the 7th, 8th, and he died in December. Just a month later.
how were you notified that he had died?
Well, they still shipped the bodies home. So we would still had a funeral for my father.
And where was he buried?
Where we lived with my aunt in a small town there. They knew exactly where they kept track of everybody in Germany. I mean, their record keeping was unbelievable, and they knew where everybody went. They shipped the body home to us.
And have you been back there?
No.
No. Do you have any desire to go back there?
I had a free trip offered to go to Berlin for a week, all expenses paid, with my wife. I told him, no, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't want anything to do with them.
Right.
Well, I went back during the war. In fact, I went back to one of the towns where we used to live, but there was nobody there. I mean, we were all gone.
What was the name of that town?
Salzkotten, Salzkotten, was a small town.
And how were you able to get back to there? Were you with your unit when you went back?
No, they let me use this was after we were occupying, sort of right before the war ended. They let me use a Jeep and a driver, and we went, and they let me go there.
Had you studied English
In school? Yeah, in the segregated school.
So tell me about when the government then confiscated, I guess, your aunt's land, and you went to live with your brother.
My uncle.
Yeah, with her brother, with your uncle. Tell me, in that time period, from that time period to when your mother found a way to get you out.
Well, let's see. It probably was, we probably lived there for a year before I left. And I didn't get out till August, actually it was August 1st, 1941. The American consulates were already closed. There was, like I said in the speeches, I was probably one of the last Jews to get out legally.
And tell me how that happened.
Well, it was the children's transport. And we went from Berlin.
I'm sorry, how did your mom get you onto that transport, do you know?
She took me to Berlin.
Okay.
She took me first to a place called Stuttgart where to get my visa. And then when the time came to where the transfer was leaving, she took me to Berlin and took me to the train station and put me on a train. And it took us a little over 3 weeks to get to New York.
What did you think about when your mom said she was going to send you away?
Well, I mean, we had no choice. My mother actually had a chance to go to England as a maid, but she couldn't take me, so she didn't go. I've regretted it ever since, but at that time when I was 15 years old, I don't know exactly what I was thinking.
So, in reality, your mother gave her life to save you.
That's exactly right.
The other kids that were on the transport with you, was there any bonding with them?
No, well, only on the way over here after New York. Some of them stayed in New York, some went all over. I was the only one that came to St. Louis. No, I never stayed in touch with any of them.
And so your aunt and uncle, tell me about your aunt and uncle. Tell me about the trip over and your aunt and uncle picking you up.
Here? Well, they met me at Union Station. And first thing, well, I have to go back.
Okay.
When they put me on a train in New York, they gave me $10. This is sort of a funny story. And they told me, they gave me a sack lunch for dinner that night. And they told me like $5 for breakfast in the dining car the next day, and $5 for dinner, or lunch the next day. Anyway, so we went to breakfast, and I knew some English. I knew ham and eggs, and I knew orange juice. That was about it. So that's what I ordered. So the waiter asked me, he said, did I want toast? Well, I know what toast is, but I didn't know that was the name for toast. So when I got all done eating, they'd bring me this finger bowl. And I thought this was the toast, but I didn't know what to do with it, so that was that. And then I found out I was going to get to St. Louis a few hours earlier than they told me, so I saved my $5 and made my uncle take me out to lunch. That was the first thing I did.
So here you are in this strange country alone. Tell me about that.
Well, 3 weeks later, I had to go to school, and they wouldn't accept me at Soldan because they didn't think I knew enough English. So I had to go to the only junior high school they had in the city of St. Louis. It's a technical junior high school. And during English, they would take one of the brightest students, and she'd go out in the hall with me and talk about what we were. I don't know if you ever read the Iliad and Odyssey, but it was the first book I had to read, so, the this and the thous.
That's hard.
Yeah. So anyway, they did send a kid out in the class outside with me, and she tried to translate whatever I didn't understand. And my uncle left here 6 months later. My aunt had a brother in Arkansas who owned several what they called department stores, so little dry goods stores. And his sons were drafted in the Army, so he needed somebody to help him. So he asked my uncle to come down there to help. And the Family and Children's Service people at the time were taking care of me, as well as my uncle, thought I'd be better off staying here. So they went to Arkansas, and I got to stay with the family here.
So who did you stay with here?
Dalen's. I don't know if you know Harry Dalen, the dentist, his parents, and I stayed with them. About 6 months ago, I said to my wife, I said, "It just hit me. You realize I was an orphan? I never knew it, because I stayed with the Dalens, who was like family. And then after I came back from the war, I found another family to stay with, and they treated me like family there. So just till 6 months ago, I never knew I was an orphan. I don't know what made me think of that, but
I mean, but that's true.
it is true.
It's absolutely true.
So all my life, I've been very lucky.
Right. So it was Jewish
Family and Children's, I don't know what they were called then. It wasn't Jewish Family and Children's, but they had a woman who was I guess my social worker, who took care of everything I needed. Took me to the doctor, took me to the dentist, bought me clothing. If there were some special events that they had tickets for, they'd take me there.
So how did you find the strength to do this on your own?
I don't know. It was just there. I mean, I never thought about a lot of things. I just did them,
Survival?
I guess.
And
In fact, they got me a job, I think 6 months after I got here, they got me a job at the Chase Hotel as a busboy, and I worked there every day after school.
did you get connected, since you didn't have family here anymore? There were a lot of other survivors, immigrants, who had come here.
Only one boy who was in school with me, who was from Germany. At that time, he was the only survivor I really knew as a friend, although I did play soccer with a bunch of German kids for a couple of years. But I never got that involved with the survivors. Most of the Jewish people here are not, there's not many German Jews live here. Mostly Eastern Europe.
So you had to grow up pretty fast. You didn't have much of a childhood.
I think I did, though. I really did, to a certain extent, especially after I got to college. Made a lot of friends there, and they're still my friends today.
So you built a life for yourself.
Right. After I got out of the Army and went to college, this is when I made all my friends.
Tell me about joining the Army.
Well, it's like I said, I was drafted shortly after graduation. Sent to Texas for basic training, and then I volunteered for the paratroops and went through all that training. Ended up in France and Germany. One of the teachers recently even asked me a question: did I encounter any anti-Semitism in the Army? And I had to tell him I encountered very little, and what was done was usually done as a joke.
Most of the other soldiers, the American soldiers, did not know what was happening in Germany.
That's right. Most of the Americans didn't know, or didn't want to know.
And you obviously knew what was happening.
Right.
Did you tell people? Did you talk about it?
Probably not too much.
Why do you think you didn't talk about it?
I didn't start talking about the Holocaust till 3 years ago. My grandson made a video for History Month, and they interviewed me for the video. In fact, they've got it here somewhere. And that's when I started talking about it. I never talked about that. Never talked about the Army either. Not just, I wasn't the only one. I mean, most of us just did not talk about the war or talk about the Army.
Why?
We don't know. It's the theory that maybe we all have a guilt complex that we survived and others didn't. But once I started, I call it coming out of the closet. Now I want to talk. But it took, I didn't talk till about 3 years ago.
And why is it important for you to talk?
I think it's important that we make sure that the kids today are taught to be tolerant. I feel that very strongly. And it's sort of my mission. And whenever I get a chance to talk, I run.
So tell me what it means to you to be able to be here talking to these children today.
Well, for one thing, I can tell the story of my people, and that they probably don't know a lot about. And maybe by me telling them that story, that maybe they'll become more tolerant of other minorities and people like that.
So when they walk out of here, when they get back on that bus, what is the message? What do you want them to leave with?
Just that. You know that I've gotten some teachers make every kid write a letter. And it's amazing the kind of letters I get. Talk to Clayton High School. They sent a big poster with every kid writing a little message and a thing. And that's so satisfying to get that they really listen. They may not get the whole story, but they get part of it.
Absolutely. So have you told your grandchildren? Do they know?
My grandchildren know, yeah.
And is it cathartic? Is it good that you have finally started speaking? Is it good for you?
Oh, I don't know if it really makes a big difference for me. I don't think it's a cathartic at all. I just feel that I'm finally able to talk about it. And I should have done years ago, but never did.
So I just want to go back to where we kind of veered off. When you were drafted, you became the paratrooper. What was that like for you going back into Germany?
I think it was probably a mission of revenge. Probably I didn't even realize it. I think years later I finally accepted the fact that this is what I wanted to do. And then, while I was there, I did also have a chance to go around looking for graves of unknown graves of some Allied flyers that were shot down. They were buried somewhere. I had a chance to talk to a lot of Germans. And the amazing thing was there was not one of them had ever been a Nazi, which I knew wasn't true, but all of a sudden they were all gone, right after the war.
That must have been an incredible experience to be a German citizen who escaped, left, coming back, fighting for, the Americans. And here you are, I guess you were fluent in both English and German at that time.
That time, yeah.
So was it a dichotomy? How did you, I know you're talking about revenge, but when you spoke with them, how did you handle yourself?
I was an American. By that time I was 100% American. Never spoke German anymore in this country. That was it. Like I said, would never accept a trip. Others have gone back to see where they were from. I have no desire to do that. I don't ever want to give them anything or accept anything from them.
Well, they took everything away from you.
Right. But I know I had some relatives who were so excited because they were getting Social Security from Germany. I didn't want any of it. I didn't want to ever be have to say thank you to them.
You were a young boy.
Yeah. I grew up and I don't know, no, there was another question I had. Did I still feel any animosity towards the German people? I don't think I ever hated the German people, the people themselves. I think it was just a big disappointment of what they didn't do. They let things happen that nobody did anything to stop it.
I mean, that's what you described to the children in
Right.
there.
That nobody said anything when the synagogue was burning. Right.
Right. Which the message that I know that you were telling them was that it starts small,
Right.
slowly.
Yeah.
Privileges get taken away. People's minds change. So,
Well, that's, I think that was the beginning right there when they burned the books. And they was just completely brainwashed already then. They just accept orders without ever questioning them.
do you think that that it'll happen again?
In Germany, or anywhere in a other than a third world country? No, I don't think so.
So there is hope that from your suffering, we're learning.
Oh, I think so. I think we learned a lot. I think we're still learning today. That's why we talk. So the kids today, maybe they'll grow up and they'll know better.
I mean, it really is a wonderful thing that you're doing.
Not only that, I want to do it.
Right.
Finally.
I mean, the children are very lucky to be able to hear your story.
Okay.
And they're your age.
That's right. So it's the way I talk, and I hope it's a good thing. I can't talk about being in a concentration camp. I can't talk about anything else. But I can talk about what it was like growing up, and I think maybe they can relate to that.
Well, and they have their mothers and fathers,
I know,
grandparents.
right.
Yours were taken away.
Yeah.
So they need to know that can happen.
Sure.
I guess, let me ask you, I know that we were talking a few minutes ago that you have been appointed to the commission. What are your hopes for that?
The same thing. Feel that I know now that they're already teaching it at some schools, some school districts, but we don't really know when they're teaching it, how they're teaching it. So the first thing we got them to do at the first meeting we had was the two commissioners of the board, what do they call it? The Board of Education, the heads of the secondary schools and the higher education, whatever they, what are they? Not commissioners.
I don't know.
Anyway, they were there, they were at the meeting, and they're going to start sending out surveys, at least to start with, to the 50 most populated school districts, or the biggest school districts in the state, with a very short questionnaire. When they're teaching it, what they're teaching, and how they're teaching it, and what materials they're using. And the idea we have is that we want to provide learning materials to them, suggestions on how to teach it, what kind of books to use. Every school uses a different book for the kids to read. But but at least they're doing it. But maybe if we can get it a little bit more organized, that they all sort of teach it at the same time, the same way. Because right now we don't really know who's teaching what and when.
Right. And you were saying that, a lot of people believed that that in the small towns they don't know of the Holocaust, but you were telling me otherwise.
They know.
Tell me what you said about the small
With
towns.
Spurgeon, they came here with a busload of, I think they were 8th graders. And there was another group that I was supposed to talk to, and they came here. And they they listened to they went through the museum, they listened to the whole program, and they came here on a 2.5-hour bus ride each way just to be here. And they even made a donation to the hospital, the Holocaust Museum, which was really nice. So they do know about it. My uncle, when he left here, moved to a small town in Arkansas. And I used to go down there a lot, quite a bit, especially after I came home from the Army to visit. And there were only 3 Jewish families living in town. Had no synagogue, had nothing there. So those people didn't know anything about Jews. So I don't know about Spurgeon. I don't know if there's any kind of a Jewish community there or not. I kind of doubt it. But they were interested enough to find out about the Holocaust. So they do learn about it. You know that in every Army installation in this country, for 10 years now, they've had Day of Remembrance celebrations at every installation? Did you know that? I didn't either. Last year I got to talk at the Record Center, and I talked at Fort Leonard Wood. And especially at Fort Leonard, both places, they had quite a celebration. And they've been doing this for 10 years. I never knew about it.
I do Yom HaShoah here every year, and we had, yes, I think from Scott Air Force Base that came and got some material to take there.
Yeah. The Fort Leonard Wood was unbelievable, what they did. The sergeant who was in charge went through all the trouble to find Jewish food to serve for lunch. That was really something. Yeah. So we are teaching it, and maybe with this commission now in the state of Missouri, maybe we can get it a little bit more organized. So.
Okay. Anything else you want to tell me?
Not really.
I know what I would say. Tell me how actually you got married and have children and grandchildren. Tell me that.
Well, actually, I married a Jewish woman from the Eastern European countries, and her mother never was too happy about it. Yeah. She died 20 years ago, sorry to say. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and they each have 2 boys.
So you have a beautiful family here in St. Louis.
Yes. And they're all here. That's even more beautiful.
Okay, and one other thing, the picture that you have of your mom and dad, how did you get those pictures?
I think I brought those with me. I was actually, my father's picture was he was this whole body, and I think I brought those with me. The picture of my mother's family, I got from my uncle here, and I'm sure I got my grandparents' picture from him. I have pictures at home, old pictures of my mother. I have a picture of my mother and me, which I'm pretty sure I brought with me. But I think quite a few of them I got from my uncle. And my father's family, I had a cousin who was did a lot of things with genealogy, and he had a lot of photographs of my parents, and actually a picture of my father while he was in the German Army. So I got a few pictures from him.
And that one picture is here in the museum?
Yeah, one of my family where I'm standing there. Yeah, that's actually my cousin brought it here. I didn't even know she had it. No, then she made copies, and that's one of them. So.
Okay.
I didn't come with too many things.
Yeah, if you came, you're lucky you came here.
Right.
So, absolutely.
Okay.